Hello, everybody here. Hello, everybody at home. And I've never done this before in any of my talks, but for the last 2 days, I've got to include a Monty Python quote. So now it's time for something completely different. The last two .NET Front-End days, I have done a talk about Azure Static Web Apps because I think they are absolutely awesome. And I'm going to continue this year, but I'm not actually going to show any Blazor code or anything. That's not true. I show a little bit of Blazor code. But what I want to talk about today is getting them ready to use professionally. Now, I've been using static web apps since about 2021, since I've been in preview anyway. I tried them for fun and I kind of got addicted. And just because you can do so much with them so easily. And then I was given a talk last year at Azure Live, and I was talking about adding authentication to static web apps. And there was somebody in the green room with me about an hour before I went on and said, yeah, static web apps, yeah, they're cool, but they're just toys. You can't do anything with them, can you? It's not like you can use them in like a proper environment. And number one, please don't ever do that to a speaker an hour before they go on stage. Tell them that their chosen technology is just a toy. But it also triggered me, and basically that's how this talk was born. How can we use it in a professional environment, and specifically, how can we use it inside something like GitHub workflows so we're not doing everything in the portal and we can get our websites live? So if my computer does what it's supposed to do, which of course it's not going to. Hi, I'm Stacy Cashmore. I am Tech Explorer DevOps for Omniplan, a financial software advice company based in Amsterdam in the Netherlands. Been developing software since the middle of the 1990s or so, and since 2020, I think, I've been able to call myself a Microsoft MVP for developer technologies, and I'm still so honored to be able to do that. So what I want to do first of all is take a look at the default pipeline that we have inside of an Azure Static Web App, because I just want to show you what you get out of the box when you do everything via the portal, which isn't what you want to do on a day-to-day basis in the office, and then see what issues it gives us, and then we're going to write our own pipeline to try and fix this. Now, if I've set up my demo correctly, my computer's not gone on me as it did this morning, I should hopefully, nope, that's a great start. The first demo not working. We'll cheat. 2 seconds. Where is my code? Right. Here's my speaker notes. And what we have down here is the default pipeline. So an Azure Static Web App, if you've never used them, you go into the portal, you click Create Static Web App, you hook it up to your GitHub or your Azure DevOps repo, and the portal will talk to your repo. It will create you a pipeline. It will set up some secrets to make everything connect, and you end up with what you see here. So we have a name, which is, okay, Azure Static Web App CI/CD, but it's not exactly useful for your own benefit. It doesn't tell you exactly what you're deploying. We do have a really useful CI/CD trigger here. So on a push to the main branch, we're going to trigger this workflow. On a pull request, when it's open, synchronized, reopened, or closed, we're going to trigger this workflow. And we have two jobs inside of here. One of them runs when we push something into the main branch, and one of them is triggered when we do a pull request with anything other than closed. And it's all based on this wonderful task here, Azure Static Web Apps Deploy. I always say an amazing little action. It's not an amazing little action. It's a very complex little action that looks very little from the outside. This does all sorts of magic for our Azure Static Web App. It will go to your repo. It will look inside of these two folders. So your client and API folder, if that's what you specified. And it's clever enough to have a look at what programming language you are using, and it will build your application based on what you have in there. So I can switch my code out from Blazor to Angular, and I don't have to change this pipeline. It just knows that it's changed, it builds it all, and then when it's built, it deploys it up to my Azure Static Web App. It does the same for an API. If my static web app has an API to deliver dynamic content, it will build the Azure functions, figure out what language it is. It will tell the Azure Static Web App what language it needs to expect because it needs to provision these Azure functions. And then it uploads everything. That's if we'd only do a push to a main. If we're in a pull request, it does something even more spectacular. It creates those staging environments on the fly so that we can test our changes inside of production. When you've not inside of production, in a production-like environment, that would be way better than testing in production. Once we've done that and everything's working and we want to go live, we then need to clean it up. And Azure Static Web App, you get 2 staging slots out of the box on the free tier, 5 on the standard tier, I believe, that you pay for. So you don't want to leave these things lying around. So there's a second job inside of here that will go in and clean up those environments when you close your pull request so that you don't run out of staging slots and you can continue working. Now, this magic that you get out of the box from an Azure Static Web App is actually what makes it really easy to get started playing with these things, writing a website in React, in Blazor, in Angular, plain HTML files, and getting them out to a production-like environment with very little effort on your side. But it does have a few issues using it in a production environment, in a professional way. And the first one is to create it, we've gone into the portal and we've clicked on the create button, and you don't want to do that for all of your environments. Second one is, whilst I think that that deploy action is fairly awesome for getting started, it's also fairly opaque. You don't actually know what it's doing, and there's magic behind the scenes, which if you want to use these things in production, you might want to know about. And finally, it's a really simple workflow. There's no tests, there's nothing going on aside from just build it, deploy it, and hope that it works when you get there. So what I want to do today, as I say, is actually turn this environment or turn this pipeline from that really simple out-of-the-box experience into something that you can run over and over. And hopefully in the next 40 minutes, we can get to the point where we can deploy an application to a custom domain on the fly when we want to and get our code into there. So the first one that I want to do is actually just what can we do inside of our pipelines to create these Azure Static Web Apps rather than doing it in the portal. So for that one, we're going to make a new GitHub workflow, and we're going to add a new folder, and hopefully I'm going to put it in the right place, which I didn't the last time I did this demo. And if I've got this folder in the right place, then any YAML that we put in here, if you're not familiar with GitHub Actions, will be picked up inside of your repo as a workflow that we can run against our code. So we're going to make a new file here, and we're going to call that IAC, Infrastructure as Code. And we're going to get rid of that. Is this legible at the back, by the way, this font size? Is that okay for everybody? Awesome. So first part of our workflow that we're going to build is just give it a name. So we want to create and set up our SWA infrastructure, and the trigger that I'm using for this is just a workflow dispatch because I don't want to run this every time I change my code. I only want to run this when I actually need to change the infrastructure that I'm running on. Next up, I need some environment variables. So these are just variables that I'm going to use throughout my workflow so that I don't have to keep on writing them over and over. A few weeks ago, GitHub actually did a blog post that not only can you have repo secrets, but they're introducing repo variables as well. But they're in GA at the moment, so I'm not. They're in preview at the moment, so I'm not including them in the demo. They are super useful because a lot of these things I'm going to be using between each of the pipelines I write today, and you can really introduce typos when you do that. I certainly can. But for now, I'm keeping these environment variables. And then we want our jobs. what are we actually going to do inside of this workflow? We're only going to have one job in this workflow. This one's going to be quite a simple one. We just want to create the static web app so that we can load something into it in a separate pipeline. And I want to be able to type. So in order to do that, there's a few steps that we need to take. Number one, we need to check out our code because I'm going to be adding a bicep file to this in a minute to create the static web app. So we need access to that. Number two, in order to do this, we are going to be using the Azure CLI in order to update our environment. So we need to log in with Azure in order to do this. I am cheating here and just using a credential way of logging in. There are better ways of doing this. I will put links to that on Twitter later on, but this works perfectly well for a demo. And then lastly, I just want to run a little bit of a script against that Azure CLI. Number one, I want to create my resource group. So can I make this smaller so you can see all of the text? No, I can't. Thank you so much. Code. So here we're just going to create a resource group that we can deploy into. Next up, we actually want to create our application itself. Now, I'm going to do the code before I do the bicep here. But what we have is just by using the AZ command line deployment group create, we can tell it a resource group to talk to. We can give it a bicep file, which tells it what to provision, and we can create our static web app. And last but not least, my static web app uses Cosmos DB. So I need to add just a few environment variables to my static web app, just a few, in order to get that one working. And we have a different AZ command here, an AZ Static Web App that's been introduced reasonably recently, and that allows us access into this new Azure Static Web App resource so that we can manipulate it from the command line again, rather than as in the beginning where we had to do everything via the portal. And yeah, that wasn't necessarily what you want for production. So that's our first pipeline, just three Azure CLI commands in order to create the resource group, the application, and set the environment variables. The last thing that we need is our static web app itself. So we're going to make a new file in the root and call that main.bicep. Anybody here use bicep? Okay, we have one person. That's cool. Bicep is an extension on top of the Azure Resource Manager. That's how you control things inside of Azure. And basically, if I remember correctly, it's called bicep because biceps make your arm strong, and normally you use arm templates to affect Azure. And I'm going to use a really basic bicep template here. In order to create my static site, I need to give it a name, a location, and a SKU. You can do a lot more with this, depending on what you need to do with it, but this will give you just a nice basic application that you can deploy into. So to control this, I have three parameters I'm passing in. One is a location, but I'm actually basing that location on the resource group I'm deploying into. Then we have the name of our static web app, which you must always set. And then we have the SKU that you want, and I'm just defaulting that to the free tier. With all this in place, I can now actually skip that first step that I was talking about in the portal, and we can create our static web app. So let's do that now. I want to commit this, add IAC. This is the point where it gets interesting. Last time I did this, I created this file in the wrong place and nothing worked for about 5 minutes. So keep your fingers crossed. This is my GitHub repo for this application. I'm not going to show it you yet. I'm going to show it you when it's working in production. But if I refresh my screen, we now have this workflows file. And that should mean that we have create and set up SWA infrastructure. So we're going to kick off that workflow. That's going to provision the static web app in Azure for us. That's going to take maybe a couple of minutes to run. So while that's running, I want to do the next step, and that's give ourselves a custom domain for our static web app so that we know where we can access the resource that we've uploaded to the cloud. So for that one, we're going to come back to our code and we're going to add a new, let's have a look, we can close the bicep one. We're going to add a new workflow and we're going to call that custom domain.yaml because this is a workflow that's only going to affect custom domains. I'm going to be honest, I'm putting this in a separate workflow because I expect it to fail the first time because DNS records are a pain in the neck. And if I do have to rerun it, I don't want to wait for everything to go through the Azure Resource Manager again. So again, we have our name, set up a custom domain, try and keep it descriptive. And this is also on Workflow Dispatch because I don't expect that you're going to be running this one very often. Only after you first provision your application. You can even change from a free tier to a standard tier. You can change parameters inside your static web app. You won't need to rerun this domain flow, so keep it separate. Again, we need some environment variables, which is why I was saying that these should really be in that new repo variables that we have available in preview. And then this is also only going to have one job. And again, we're going to check out some code because I've got an application that I need to run inside of my workflow in a second. And we're going to log into Azure because this is still going to be using that AZ CLI. So we need access to my Azure subscription. Now, in order to set up your custom domain, there's a few things that you need. One is the host name. For anybody who's ever worked with Azure App Services, the host name included the name of the resource itself, which made naming interesting because you had to have a name that was unique around the whole world. And I've seen some really interesting naming conventions in different companies to make sure that this happens and nobody steals their domain. A static web app is different. The name of the application only has to be unique inside of your resource group. But that means you don't know what your URL is. It will provision you a happy beach, a yellow river, a gray sky, all sorts of different names just to ensure that you get a unique URL, but you don't know what it is at the time that you provision your account. Thankfully, we can get this out using a command. And I might bring this across to my terminal just so that you can see it better. Otherwise, I'm going to be scrolling left and right. So again, using that static web app command that we have inside of the Azure CLI, what we can do is just get a list of all environments. Now, we're just creating a new one, so we'll only have one environment. But if you create a staging environment, that's going to be in this list as well. You need to know which one to get out. We can query that list, and the default host name is always your production environment. So using this command, we can get out that host name that we need. And then all I'm doing, if you just use this GitHub output, then you just make this variable available in different stages of your workflow so you can use it further on. So now that we have our host name, I now actually need to make my DNS record. Now, I'm not going to go into too much detail with this one, just because depending on your DNS provider depends on how you do this. As you might guess, I use Portbun for my DNS, and they have a really nice API. So I've just written a little application which is going to take that host name I've created and set up the required DNS record on my domain so that I can use it inside of my static web app. It's you just need to put the host name from your static web app underneath a CNAME for the subdomain that you want to use for your custom domain. You can also do this for Apex domains, but that's a bit more work, and this is generally a 60-minute talk, so I'm not going to go into that today. But ask me about it later if you wish. And then we can actually add that custom domain. And for that one, again, we still use this same host name. So we now use a host name, and all we do is just set the name of our static web app inside of our resource group. And I'm just setting it to a domain name.stacy.cloud. And I think I will set that one to, can I type? .NET front end day. I didn't spell that right, did I? Front end day. That'll do. And that's it. That's all that we have to do inside of our YAML file in order to make sure that we can access our custom domain. So I'm going to push this one up as well. Add custom domain. Now we can go back and see whether or not our workflow worked. Yay! I have a static web app. If I refresh this page, we should hopefully have this second one, set up custom domain. I'm going to run this one now because, like I say, it's about a 75% hit rate I have on this. About 75% of the time, the DNS records propagate in time, and about 75% of the time, I need to do a second run. While we're waiting for that, if I come into Azure and refresh my resource groups, we should have a new one, and we don't. Why do we not have a new one? This is fun when demos go weird. It worked, but it failed. Resource group and demo RG. Okay. Do we have the static web app? This is really interesting. I'm on my TARDIS. Give me 2 seconds. I just want to make sure that's not gone to the wrong account because I've done something strange. If all else fails, I do have a backup. Nope, that's not there either. Okay, if all else fails, here's one I made earlier. So this is my backup. I'm still going to carry on doing the YAML files to show you what you need to do. And well, if it worked, then this is what you would be seeing. So we have our end demo application here. And you can see this one's already got a custom domain added to it. And basically, yeah, it just creates as our Azure Static Web App, as it would if we just created it through the portal. So the next thing that we need to do now is get some code into that application. So the way that I'm going to do that is actually start off on the command line so that you can see the different commands that we need to use in order to upload things. And then we will do it inside of a pipeline itself. So in my app, what I want to do is just add a little bit of code to my application. And this is the only Blazor that you're going to see, just so that we can see how things are deployed. So on my main page, I'm just going to have deployed by CLI, deployed by pipeline, and deployed by staging, I believe. The other one that we need to do inside of our application, in the introduction, I said that in order to deploy, or when you did the default deploy, it actually updated your Azure Static Web App to tell you what language that you were using inside of your application for your Azure functions. We're not going to be doing any of that. We're just going to be uploading compiled code directly. So we need to tell the Static Web App directly what kind of language it can expect. In a Static Web App, in our www root folder, we can control all sorts of things inside of our Azure Static Web App. I've just got some code in here to put some authorization for my API. I've got a navigation fallback for my front end so that that works nicely if we refresh a screen. It can do a lot more than just these few things, but that is literally a talk on its own. But what we're going to do is just add a little platform directive at the top there. So this is just going to tell it to use the .NET isolated platform for our Azure functions. That's what this is coded in. If you're doing something different, then there are a lot more platforms that we can use. Hey, it knows I'm no longer in the net. Oh no, there we go, Dutch. I don't know why it keeps on putting Dutch. My language is set to English on the machine. But you can see that there's all sorts of different runtimes that we can do here. And you've just got the different settings that you need in order to do that. So we have .NET 6 in process, .NET 6 isolated, .NET 7 isolated, Node 14, 16, 18 in preview, but that doesn't work well on the machines, and even Python in order to get Azure functions working to get dynamic data into our apps. I say I'm using .NET Isolated 7, so that's the runtime that I need to do. Now that I have my runtime available, I can actually publish my application. So we're going to publish the client, we're going to publish the API, and then we're going to upload it. And hopefully that will actually tell us where it's running and we can do something with it. Hopefully my machine's not getting too upset at me. Nope, that's nice and quick. These new little Dell laptops are absolutely stunning for performance. We're going to publish our API. Then after that point, we need to do a push to production. Now, the way that a static web app works, it has a deployment token. You don't publish to your resource group and resource name. You actually have to get a specific key, which you then give to Azure, and it knows where to put your code. That's something that gets put into your repo automatically if you use a portal, but we need to get that ourselves now. We can get that out using this AZ Static Web App secrets list, and then we can just look for the API key, stick that into a variable, get a nice error that wasn't there yesterday, and now we can deploy our application. So for that, I'm now using something different. This isn't the AZ command line. This is an issue, and I hope that Microsoft sorted it at some point. I've so far used AZ, and I'm now using the Azure Static Web App CLI, two completely different things. This one is installed via NPM. It runs using Node.js, and this is the only way that we can deploy to our application. The only way we can do the other stuff that we've done is using that AZ command line, and it would be really nice at some point if those two could just kind of converge so that we didn't have to work between the two of them. We're using that deploy token that we just had, and if we push this up, we can keep our fingers crossed, and if everything goes well, this takes about 30 seconds, and if everything doesn't go well, then we'll come back to it in a few minutes. So uploading the artifacts in progress. This is nice. It only updates every 15 seconds. So it's like, is it still uploading? Is it finished? What's it doing? There we go. We're 15 seconds. If it gets to 30, I'll give up and continue doing other things and come back later. What will be nice from this, if this works nicely, it will at least give us that URL of our newly deployed application that for some reason isn't visible inside of my portal, and we can still see it working. There we go. I have an ambitious mushroom. Told you they're awesome names. And if I open this now, that is the application that I've just deployed from my own machine running inside of production. and even say she hopefully. Did my action work or did it? Hey, my action worked. So we should also be able to go to .NET front end day .stacy .cloud. And we have a custom domain from the URL inside our 30 minutes of starting this talk. Thank you, demo gods. So that is how we get it from the command line. Let's put this into a pipeline, and then we'll have a look at our staging environments for the last part. So where are we? I have too many windows open. So we're going to add yet another pipeline, of course. So I need to add a new workflow. And this one is going to be build and deploy. Now, one thing that you might be able to see here is I have taken that one pipeline that Azure gives, and I've made 3 pipelines out of it because I want to do the 3 different things that we're doing. On the one hand, it's a lot more code, and on the other hand, it at least separates things in a nice way so you actually see what's going on. So we're going to kick off this pipeline with a nice name, build and deploy application. We have the same trigger that we had from that pipeline that was created for us, with just one difference. We're now got 2 paths that we're ignoring because when we change the infrastructure as code pipeline, when we change the custom domain pipeline, we don't want to rebuild the site. There's no need because you don't need to redeploy the site just because you've updated the static web app itself. Next, we need those environment variables again, because yet again, we need to know the resource group and the resource name that we're trying to deploy to. And then we need to do our .NET work. So this is going to be our first job, and I'm going to cheat originally and only have one job. The if for our build and test stage is exactly the same as it is in our automatic pipeline. We have on push to main, and we have our pull request for anything that isn't closed. We're going to check out our code, because if we're going to deploy the code, it's quite useful to have it. And because we're no longer using that magic action from Microsoft, we need to set up .NET. So we're going to run .NET 7. I'm not going to run preview for this pipeline. I want it to actually work with just the latest general availability. And then I can do my build steps. So I've got 3 steps here. One that I didn't show locally, which is running my test to make sure that things are actually doing what they're supposed to be doing. Publishing my client and publishing my API. That's what we've just seen inside of the command line. Then we need to get our Azure workflow. And there's a really important step here. We're logging into Azure, same as we did before. And then we're getting our secret out. Now, we're still using this secrets list that we used previously in our CLI. But there's a really important step, and that's this. GitHub workflows are really good at hiding your secrets a lot of the time. Not all of the time. And if you don't put this echo and add mask in place, then anytime somebody looks for your logs, they're going to see your secret and they're going to be able to deploy to your application. And maybe we don't want that. And then we're echoing that out again to the GitHub output so we can use it later on inside of our flow. Interesting aside to this one, if you try and do an output from a job, it doesn't work if you add a mask to the variable that you're trying to output. It only allows it to be shared inside of the job that you're working on. So now that we've got our secret, we can actually do our deploy. For that, we need to install that static web app CLI. So we need to, first of all, install Node. It has to be Node 16. You can go to Node 16.19, but you can't use Node 18. The static web app does not like anything above Node 16 yet. I think that that's kind of in progress. And once we have Node installed, then we can do our last 2 steps. That is, we can install the Azure Static Web App CLI, and that's also obviously how you install it locally. And then we can call the same SWA deploy that we called on the CLI, using the secrets that we've just got, and into our environment production. This flag is really important. If you skip it, it defaults to an environment called preview. I'm just currently putting it in production. We're going to be changing that for our staging environments in a couple of minutes. But right now, this is everything that we need to do. Everything's still okay on the stream? So one last thing that I want to do before I make my commit is I want to change my page. So we've now deployed via the production pipeline flow. We have 3 files, and we can push this up. Add, build, and deploy. Thank you. Yeah. So, and you can see here that we deployed via the CLI. So you can see that it came from my machine. If we go to our actions now, you can already see it. We now have this new build and deploy pipeline running. This takes about 2-3 minutes. So while that's running, let's have a look at our staging environment. So what we're going to do is add a new branch to our application. We're going to add the staging environments to the branch, and then we're going to make a pull request, and we're going to see that that new pipeline is kicked off at that point. So we're going to create a new branch, and that's add staging. And in our staging branch, we're not going to be adding any more files. What we're going to be doing instead is just extending the one that we just built. First of all, let's change this from pipeline flow to via PR so we can see the difference in what we're doing. Can close this one, and then we can go back to our build and deploy and start working through it. Now, when I do a deploy, I want to make sure that I can easily roll back to a previous version if needs be. So one thing that I want to do is split up my deploy and my build steps. So I'm going to add a new step inside of my flow that I can rerun on demand at will and deploy an older version should I need to. In order to do that, I need to upload my code when it's finished building to GitHub artifacts. Once I've got that uploaded, I can then create a new job. So everything that I've just done in one job, we can now split up into a second. This one runs again on the same, if it's on push to main or if we are in a pull request for anything other than closed, but it will only run if build and test is successful, because obviously if it failed in building, we don't really want to deploy anything. And then the first step that we do is download our application from the artifacts so that we can continue working with it. Then to get that environment sorted. So if we come down here, I want to add an extra step because I showed you that we're always deploying to production right now, but I don't want to always deploy to production. I want this to be smart. So we're going to set up a new step. And this is just going to check what's happening inside of the workflow. So if the workflow is a push, then we can assume that this is going to main. It's a production run. If it's not pushed, then we can assume that it is a pull request, and we can set up a new staging environment. The important part here is this one. Between staging and the event number, so the PR number that I want to use for my environment name, there are no spaces, no dashes, no nothing, because if you do that, it doesn't give you any errors. All it does is default to deploying to the preview environment that it wants to do, and you have no idea where your code has gone. And now we have our environment, we can update our deploy step to deploy to that environment that we've just made. And when this runs now, it's going to create a new environment if it doesn't exist in a pull request so that we can test our code. But there's something else that that default pipeline does, and that's give you easy access to that new environment. So if you do a pull request, it will run the build, And in the pull request itself, it tells you where your build has been deployed to so that you can easily find it, test it, and check that everything's doing what you want. So I want to do the same thing here as well. So we have a couple of extra steps that we want to do. The first one is getting the host name. Now, this is using the same command that we used in order to write our custom domain. Only now what we're going to be querying for is if the host name contains our environment, because every time you spin up a new environment for an Azure Static Web App, that environment name is included in the URL. So we can use that to get that information out. We're going to make that available for the next step. And then I'm going to add a step, which is actually just going to write our pull request for us. So this is using GitHub script. And basically what you do is give it some markdown, inject some variables into it, and it will create you a bot comment on your pull request. So what we're going to do is just give a little message that says, you can test here, and then give the place where you can test. And the change was pushed by whoever kicked off this pipeline. So whoever committed the code that kicked off this pipeline. And then we're going to use the GitHub REST in order to update our pull request. And last but not least, we need to do a little bit of cleanup, because when you close your pull request, like I say, you've only got 2 staging slots or 5 in a standard environment. You want to make sure that you clean up after yourself. So we're going to add one last job. This one is only going to run when we close our pull request. We log in with the Azure CLI again, and then all we do is just call this AZ Static Web App Environment Delete. We know that this is only going to run in a pull request, so we can just say get rid of staging and then the number of the pull request. Something that I really hate about this is the fact that I'm deploying with, where am I deploying? I'm deploying with SWA deploy, but I have to clean up again with AZ Static Web App. It just feels a little bit disparate, but I'm sure that it's going to come together in time, and this does work. So now we've got this. Let's push this up, create a pull request, and hopefully that will get deployed in enough time. Yep, I want you to add the remote branch. My build and test work, so we'll look at that one in a second as well. And if I come into my pull request, I should now be able to create a pull request for this staging environment. So let's create that. It takes a couple of seconds for it to pop up, but hopefully we're going to see that it starts to build something in a second. There we are. So that's now going to create that staging environment for us. And in the meantime, if I come back to my .NET frontend day.stacy.cloud, we can see that it's now been deployed by the production pipeline. So we already have our CI/CD. We're now just making it nicer to be able to test changes that we're doing. One thing that I do want to show you, though, whilst this is deploying, is how we can do this locally, because you don't want to push everything up to the cloud in order to be able to test it. You want to be able to test it locally and be fairly sure it's going to work when you push it up to Azure. And for that one, we can also use that SWA CLI. In fact, it was originally created for that purpose. When it was in preview, all that you could do is run your static web apps locally using the command line, because before that, it was a real pain to run it locally. Inside of a static web app, you can have Azure functions for an API, and you have static files for your front end. You have this wonderful little glue in the middle, and it joins everything together and makes it easy. You don't need to stress about cores, as Gerald was doing earlier today. When you're running locally on your machine, you're running your front end on one port number, your back end on another port number, and things kind of don't work that nicely. There was a load of boilerplate that you could do to get it working, but then they came up with this static web app CLI, and it all worked for us. So I'm going to run this SWA start. So I want to start my static web app. I'm just going to run my distributed files, so the published files, and I want dist client, I believe I called it. No, I don't. I want dist client / www root, if I've remembered the name correctly. So now this spins up a Node.js server on my machine, and it pretends that it's an Azure Static Web App. That word pretends is really important. It has about 99% of the functionality, and there's about 1% which is just a little bit different. And they even give you the warning when you use the simulator. It doesn't match the cloud exactly. Always test in Azure before you go to production. But this should give us an application running locally, which gives us an error, which means it's not found my, I know why. I've not spun up my API, have I? Let's try that one again and go dash API location equals / API. What this will do now is look into my API folder, and it will spin up the Azure functions locally, and then hopefully it doesn't go boom when we log in. Says she hopefully. I kind of have a little bit of Maddie's issue. My company reinstalled my laptop last week for Intune, and since then things have been ever so slightly iffy. And I'm not convinced that that's doing what it should do, and that's because I've done a typo. There we go. That's restoring the API for us. Hopefully that's going to load up reasonably quickly. Please. Nice computer. Almost. Yep, there we go. So now we should be able to log in. The fact that it says loading there actually shows that it's working. I have authentication on this so that I'm the only person that can save my to-do list. Everybody else just gets a transient to-do list on this page. So if it says loading, that means it's actually connecting to my Cosmos DB and things are doing what it should do. So that's how we can run this locally. You can also run it locally by running your application inside of Visual Studio, inside of VS Code, however you run your application, and connecting directly to your dev server so that you can also do debugging directly from the application as you need it. Now, I have a couple of minutes left. Please, come on. You should have deployed by now. You're supposed to be quicker than this. Just check my action and see where we are. Oh, look at that. It did actually succeed just because I said, please work. So we now have this GitHub action bot. It's told us where we can deploy. And if we open this, we can see we have our ambitious mushroom. Our custom domain is not used for our staging environments. And we're deploying to our staging 1 slot so that we can see what's happening inside of Azure before we go to production. If I close this now, you're not going to get to see the end of this because it takes too long to run. Unfortunately, I'm almost out of time. But it will now clean up my environment for me. If I go into my actions, we should see that running. Yeah, so I now have the add staging, the merge pull request. So that's going to update my actual site. And we have this add staging slot, which is just running that last one to clean up our environments. I have just 1 minute left, and there's one really important thing that I want to mention because I said that I have authentication inside of this application, and I've not showed you that via the command line. And there's a really good reason. For the standard web app, you really, really don't want to do that. You can do it via the command line, but when you try and provision users on your static web app via the command line, you have to read out a URL that's generated in the output. You have to email that to your users. They have to click on the link inside of an hour. Otherwise, the invitation goes out of date. And more than that, in the standard tier, even if you use the same authentication provider between different static web apps, you get a different user ID. Which means that if I have some reason and my whole environment gets destroyed and I spin up a new environment, I've now got loads of orphan records because all of those IDs are incorrect. If you're going to be using static web apps in this way, you need to make sure that you use a standard tier and use custom authentication, which I don't have time to show you, unfortunately. It's no code changes because authentication inside of a static web app is all abstracted out in a really nice way. But you need to make sure that you have your own authentication provider, whether or not you use Azure, Google, Twitter, Auth0, whatever you want to use. That will ensure that you have control over your users, and that user ID doesn't change between environments, so it's really easy to spin up a new one. So, I missed my Kermit slide. Damn it. That's me saying, let's finish with the slides and start whacking on a keyboard. So that is how you can spin up, or the type of things that you can do to control your own deploy flow inside of an Azure Static Web App, and hopefully get it to the point where you're not just doing it inside of the portal and treating it like a toy, but this is a serious resource that can do serious work, and you can build proper applications using it. I'm slightly over time, but I have to say thank you to these three people, to Max, Oscar, and Rick, because I am not a GitHub Actions expert, and they helped me with some of the really tricky GitHub Actions stuff that I've used inside of here. And I know that I've gone through this really quickly, but that QR code will send you to a list of resources that I used in order to get all of this working for the AZ Static Web App command line, to the Static Web App CLI itself, and a couple of other resources, a few Microsoft Learn resources, which seriously check it out, they're awesome. And as a pure self-promotion point, one of the links inside of that page is the book that I wrote last year on beginning static web apps. It doesn't actually cover what I've talked about today, but it does cover getting started with static web apps itself. On that note, I do not want to keep you from Richard Campbell for any longer, so thank you very much. Do we have any questions? Do we have time?
We have time.
Do we have questions?
He goes on 20 past, so
okay,
you're fine. My disclaimer: my chat room froze, so I might have missed a few questions. I asked them to repeat those, so I hope everyone is on here. But I do have some comments and one question.
Okay.
And one comment is, we use static web apps in production since 1 or 2 years back.
Awesome.
Perfect for SPA. Separated front end, talking REST to a .NET 7 backend API. Works nicely.
Fantastic.
I know, right? And then we have, someone found your resource.
Yeah?
Yeah, I will show you later. Where is the best place to find documentation about syntax and commands for what to write in the YAML file? Because that was one of this person's issues when learning about static web apps and GitHub Actions.
What I will do for that is I have a public repo that contains what I've just showed you. It has the YAML file already running. I will link to that one, and hopefully you can get enough on that to get going.
Perfect. Now I see it. Last slide gave me the answer. Oh, perfect. There you go. Do we have any questions in the room? Yes. Awesome.
Is it possible to lock down your staging environment some way behind like a login or something?
Thank you. I forgot to mention that. It is, but only in the standard tier. So only if you pay for it, which is a little bit unfortunate. On the free tier, your staging environments are always open. So if you don't want people to be able to see what might be going to production, don't do this. If you're on the standard tier, you can lock it down using a password. And you can do that for both the static web app itself and for the staging environment.
Do we have any more questions? That must mean you were super clear.
Then thank you very much, everybody.
And we will be back at 20 past with Richard Campbell. Thank you so much, Stacy.
Thank you.